Have you ever read a poem that was so complex, like it was filled with big words, fancy sentence structures, and you ended up feeling nothing? And then one day, you come across this poem that has one of the simplest lines, like "I wandered lonely as a cloud," and it hit you right there in the heart. No metaphors to decode, no highbrow language, just raw and honest emotion. That's exactly what William Wordsworth was fighting for when he wrote the preface to Lyrical Ballads. He believed that poetry should feel like you're being spoken to and not lectured at. And honestly, don't we all crave that? Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Riya Gandhi, and in today's video, we are going to discuss one of the most important literary documents ever written, and that is Wordsworth's Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Whether you are preparing for your UGC NET English exam, or you're exploring romanticism, or you just love some good poetry, this video will help you understand why this preface matters even today. So, stay tuned till the end of this video and don't forget to make notes. Now, before we begin talking about lyrical ballads or preface to lyrical ballads, let's first talk about the man behind the preface, right? Who is William Wordsworth. Now, when we are talking about William Wordsworth, you already know that he's not just any kind of poet. He is one of the pioneering poets of romantic literature. He, along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Robert Southey, they are sort of grouped under the first generation of romantic poets, also called as the Lake Poets. You also know that he, along with Samuel Taylor Coleridge specifically, launched the Romantic Age in English literature with their publication of Lyrical Ballads in 1798. Now, coming back to Wordsworth, he always believed in the simplicity of rural life. He always sort of was very adamant in separating the rural life and the experiences of the rural life and the experiences of the city life. He believed in the innocence of childhood and preserving that innocence. Why? Because he was very much inspired by the ideals of French Revolution. What were those ideals? Liberty, equality, and fraternity. And he adamantly believed that literature and art and philosophy could actually change society, that it had the revolutionary power. But if only they could be understood by the common people. And Wordsworth found out that if literature was to be understood by the common people, it should be taught and it should be written in the common language to ordinary people. Now that you have a basic understanding of who Wordsworth was and basically his importance in the context of literature, let's understand a bit about the time in which he was writing, the time which is popularly called as the Romantic Age in literature. So when we are talking about this age, it is said to have started, or it is said to have begun from 1798 with the publication of Lyrical Ballads and continued down, you can say, till the 1830s, right? When we are talking about the Romantic Age, it was more or less a reaction to the previous age. Right, so the previous age was basically called as the neoclassical age or the Augustan age. And if I have to describe this particular age in just one word, I would say rationality, or for that matter, reason. Now, if you are able to recall anything about the literature that was produced during the neoclassical or the Augustan age, you will realize that it was filled with writers like John Dryden, Alexander Pope, or Samuel Johnson for that matter, who sort of wrote poetry in imitation of the classical forms, right? That is why it was called as the Augustan age. And so they basically followed those rigid rules of writing poetry. In terms of the content as well, there was this cold rationality of the 18th century. So the Romantic poets said, nope, we are not doing this. We are going to talk about emotions. We are going to talk about imagination. More importantly, we are going to talk about nature, childhood, and everything that makes us feel alive, and not this logic and intellectualism that sort of like, is very boring at the same time. So they weren't interested in aristocratic language or classical forms. They believed that ordinary life is poetic enough. Nature is poetic enough. And in the depths of human emotions, you can create poetry. Having said that, now let's talk about the ultimate poetry collection that sort of launched the Romantic Age in English literature, and that is the Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads, published in 1798, is a collection of poems mostly by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So it's a collection of 23 poems, wherein 19 poems were written by William Wordsworth, and the remaining, that is 4 poems, were written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. The very first poem is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is written by Coleridge, and the very last poem, which is Tintern Abbey, it is written by Wordsworth. Now, this entire collection has literally changed the course of English literature. Why so radical? Because they used everyday language, which was in stark contrast to the neoclassical literature in which they used highbrow aristocratic language. Second, they focused on rural characters, also called as the rustic characters or the rustic life. You'll find this word being used frequently in the later part of the video. And finally, they emphasized on the real human emotions over fancy poetic devices or, any kind of fancy figurative language for that matter. Even the title itself brings home this very idea. Lyrical ballads. Lyrical stands for emotions. Ballads are basically the folk tales or the oral traditions of the countryside people. If Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, then the preface to Lyrical Ballads appeared in the second edition in 1800, right? This critical piece is so important that it continues to be read and discussed even today. It has become like this de facto manifesto of the Romantic movement. And so, to simplify its main concepts and ideas to you, I have broken down this manifesto into different parts, right, into different guidelines. So the first part basically concerns the subject matter of Wordsworth's poetry, right? So why does he choose that particular subject matter? How does he choose that? So, when we are talking about Wordsworth's poetry, it doesn't concern about Greek gods or kings, right? Because Wordsworth never believed in that. He believed that the subject matter of the previous age's poetry, basically talking about aristocracy, talking about society, he felt that it was too literary, it was too artificial, right? Instead of all of those things, he wanted to focus on the emotional truth about life. He wanted to focus on the depths of the human emotions. And therefore, he favored the more humble, the more rustic background. Rustic as in the rural existence. Because he believed that it was more simple, it was more natural. Right? He wanted to make ordinary experiences look more extraordinary. He believed that it's only in nature that you will find the permanence of life, you will find the truth of life. This, he believed, was not possible in the city life because city life was constantly profit-driven, it was more self-centric, and it was constantly fleeting. You can't find simplicity and the depth of human emotions there. You can only find in the simple, rural, rustic existence. And that is why the subject matter of his poetry would be farmers, would be children, would be shepherds, would be the common folks like you and me. And how he would do that? He basically believed that to talk about real people, to draw from their real life experiences, or to talk about their ordinary experiences, you cannot use unusual language, or you cannot use very figurative language that makes things more and more complex. We express our emotions in a very simple manner, right? That's what he wanted in poetry, to use the language of the common people. No artificial language, no added metaphors that the readers have to decode. Poetry should relate. That's all he wanted. But at the same time, he also believed that when you're talking about ordinary people in ordinary language, structured in the form of poetry, you are still allowed to make it a bit unusual. You're still allowed to make it a bit extraordinary through using your imagination, right? Adding that tinge of imagination to make it poetic. And that's when he gave the ultimate definition of poetry that you must already be knowing. And that was that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. But that's just half of the definition. The complete definition was that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. What does that mean? A lot of times we have this notion that, when you're going through a very powerful emotion because you were hurt or because of a certain incident or event, poetry just stems out and you just start writing. That's what is depicted in media and, in movies and films, right? According to Wordsworth, that's not true. When you go through a very powerful feeling, you need to follow a step-by-step process to write poetry. Sounds a bit unconventional and also artificial, which sort of like downplays his own arguments. But then this is what he said, right? So what is this step-by-step process that you need to follow? So Wordsworth says that there are 4 parts of poet's creative process. What are these 4 parts? The first part is wherein the poet observes that situation, that event, or that object from which you sort of are gaining so many powerful emotions, powerful feelings. Observation, perception, right? All of these things matter. That is the first step. Then comes the second stage, right? The second stage involves a lot of reflection, a lot of contemplation, in complete isolation, in complete tranquility. Memory becomes an extremely important part during this stage, right? So, in this stage, you can sort of remove the non-essential, the unimportant details, right? And just focus on that emotion and that particular event. The third stage is wherein the poetic creation actually begins, wherein you sort of allow your memories and your imagination to intermingle with each other, to sort of like play with each other. This is a state of, you can say, enjoyment, right? It's a state of euphoria, it's a state of bliss, wherein you sort of allow the imagination to interfere with your memories. And that's when you start creating poetry. And then finally, the fourth stage is wherein you try to compose, wherein you try to write whatever your thoughts are, whatever your imagination is telling you to write, whatever your memories are. So throughout this entire step-by-step process, he is basically trying to guide his readers into understanding that poetry is not created through classical models, through imitating the classical models, nor is it created through that immediate inspiration on any supernatural level. It occurs at a very ordinary level. We understand the situation, we reflect upon them, and we write our own emotions in a very ordinary language that everybody could relate to, right? This understanding of poetry basically makes poetry very accessible, don't you think? And as a result of which, the role of the poet in society becomes extremely essential. Wordsworth calls the poet to be the rock of defense for human nature. According to Wordsworth, poet is a person of the common people. He lives among them. He is listening to their trials and tribulations and trying to capture them in his works. He also mentioned that the poet is chiefly distinguished from other men by a greater promptness to think and feel. So for him, poet was both an ordinary person as well as someone who was special. Someone who was deeply in tune with human emotion, with imagination and moral insight, right? So, drawing the stark contrast between scientists and poets, he believed that while scientists were discovering the laws of nature, Wordsworth believed that the poet's job was to understand the laws of the heart. And so he mentions that the art of being a poet is basically being a man speaking to men. And if I want to speak to men, I am going to use the common language of the men. And again, that brings me back to the previous argument of basically Wordsworth using the ordinary language and rejecting any kind of separation, any kind of distinction between the language of prose and the language of verse. And he believed that no matter what he uses, be it poetry or be it prose, it should stem from emotion and reflection. So what's the final takeaway, guys? The final takeaway is that Wordsworth wasn't just talking about a poetic technique. He wasn't just talking about the romantic literature during his time. He was actually changing the way we look at the world. During the time that he was writing, there was increased industrialization, cities were growing, nature was disappearing, something that continues even today. So during this particular point of time, poetry is something that could bring us back to our emotional core, that it could remind us of who we are at our most human. So if you have ever written a line in your journal or jotted down a poem that felt true, you've already lived Wordsworth's philosophy. That's it for today's video, folks. If you found this video on Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads informative and helpful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more such insights on literature and UGC NET English exam. Thank you so much for watching till the end. I'll see you in the next one.